After the Bank of England cut interest rates for the first time since March 2020, senior Tories, including Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, immediately took to social media, claiming above-inflation salary increases for teachers, nurses and other public sector workers could delay any further rate reductions. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak wrote on X, "My concern now is that Labour's inflation-busting public sector pay rises have put further cuts at risk." Shadow Chancellor Jeremy Hunt wrote, "Our concern is that further substantive cuts may now take longer because of inflation-busting public sector pay rises rushed through by the Chancellor ahead of the summer." And Mel Stride, who is standing to be leader of the Conservative Party, said important that Rachel Reeves' stance on public sector pay doesn't hinder further progress by feeding service sector inflation. Government is about choices. Chancellor must stand up and own hers. The former Prime Minister had shamelessly used this completely rubbish argument over and over again in office to justify shafting public sector workers on pay.
Look, the most important thing we can do to help people is to control inflation. We've got to reduce inflation. That's what's making life difficult for nurses and for everyone else in the country. And a big part of how we are going to grip and reduce inflation is by having restraint when it comes to pay settlements.
Former Chancellor Jeremy Hunt happily went along with it.
Strike action is holding back growth. It's also leading to cancelled operations and school closures. When will you resolve these disputes?
We want to resolve the public sector strikes as quickly as we can. We're prepared to be completely reasonable. We will talk about anything except measures that will entrench high inflation.
And so did Tory leadership contender Robert Jenrick.
We want to be as reasonable as possible. Steve Barclay and other ministers have been meeting with union representatives to talk to them, to see if there are ways forward, to discuss next year's pay settlement and set out our arguments on affordability there. But I think what you see with inflation today means that if the international factors are beginning tentatively to work in the right direction, the worst thing that we could do domestically would be to significantly increase public sector pay and then entrench inflation in the British economy.
The claim was, and still is, complete bollocks. And since we're going to hear a lot of it from the Tories in the coming weeks and months, let's deal with it once and for all. It isn't rocket science. If a private sector company increases its wages, yes, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service, and that might end up increasing the price. But that's not the case with public sector workers such as education and healthcare, which are free at the point of use. That means consumers do not pay for them directly, and so they do not affect the inflation statistics. And on that, don't just take my word for it. Listen to Stephanie Flanders, an expert economist and head of Bloomberg News Economics, speaking to the BBC's Laura Kunsberg.
They're concerned that inflation, which we know is putting so much pressure on people, will be bumped further up if they hand over lots more money to the public sector. As a very expert economist, does that stack up?
It is not something that economists tend to agree with, I'm sorry, because if it is very different. If you have a private sector company increase its wages, well, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service and may well then end up meaning they have to increase the price in the shops. Obviously, that's not the case with public sector workers. There isn't a price that's going to go up. Of course, there's a bill to be paid, and one always would have to ask questions about where the money's going to come from. Is it going to squeeze other things in the health? If it's going to increase health spending, which would mean it was additional, obviously there is an additional demand on the economy which could potentially increase inflation at the margins. But I think this equivalence, people understand that if a private sector company raises wages, that's going to add to costs and to prices. It just isn't the same thing for public sector workers. And when you've had the kind of gap that's opened up since 2010 between public and private sector workers in terms of their pay, even with the difference of conditions and other things, that is in itself an issue in terms of morale and in terms of the sort of stability of the system.
And if all that isn't enough for you, the actual governor of the Bank of England told journalists right after the bank cut the cost of borrowing for the first time since March 2020 that planned pay awards of 5 to 6% for public sector workers would have a relatively small impact on headline inflation. Again, don't just take my word for it.
This is not 0 to 5.5. This is from what was already expected, and we've already been factoring in terms of what was expected in terms of this wage. This
a bit higher than maybe than you were expecting.
It was a bit higher than was put into the previous budget. But honestly, if you do that very sort of slightly abstract back of the envelope calculation, you get a very small number for inflation. It's in the sort of second decimal place range.
And let's not forget in all this that pay packets are now worth less than they were in 2008 in nearly 2/3 of UK local authorities. That millions of UK workers are currently enduring the longest pay squeeze in more than 200 years. That not since Napoleonic times has there been such a sustained period of wage stagnation. That according to the International Monetary Fund, it was rising corporate profits which were the largest contributor to Europe's inflation as companies increased prices by more than the spiking costs of imported energy. And millions of families are still suffering higher mortgage rates after the Tories' disastrous mini-budget. I'm sure UK news shows will be falling over themselves to point all this out next time a Conservative MP makes a bogus claim like this. I'll give the final word to Chancellor Rachel Reeves.
We will be open about the decisions which are needed and the steps that we are taking. That begins with accepting in full the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies, and the details of these awards are being published today. That is the right decision for the people who work in, and most importantly, the people who use our public services. Giving hard-working staff the pay rises they deserve, while ensuring that we can recruit and retain the people we need.